Hi, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world joining us. My name is Allison Flexen. I'm the Reading Program Specialist for the Reading Within Reach initiative, which supports the Global Reading Network. We're happy to have many of you from around the world joining us for our kickoff webinar on early grade reading program design and implementation, best practices and resources for success. As you may have seen already from all the announcements and the registration information, this professional development series was developed by Reading Within Reach, which is supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's been a 5-year initiative implemented by a university research company, or URC. As I just mentioned, Reach supports the Global Reading Network to develop and share research, innovations, research, and resources related to early grade reading programming. If you know anybody who would be interested in receiving our information and publications, you can encourage them to go to our website at globalreadingnetwork.net, and they can sign up to receive our newsletter and announcements about events like this one today. Our presenters for this early grade reading professional development series include myself, Amy Palangio, our Reach technical advisor, who's co-presenting on the topic today, Aristark Lino, Reach Training and Curriculum Specialist, and Adrian Barnes from Florida State University. I should note also we have a wonderful support team here at Reach. Stephanie Kenner is online. She will provide technical, logistical support, so if anyone is having issues with the Zoom technology or you have other questions, please note that you can contact her. She is, I know, sending out messages now so you know who she is and how to get in touch with her throughout this webinar. So the purpose of this webinar series is to provide all of those in the community of practice around early grade reading and related issues with the latest on evidence on information, guidance, and resources to support the design and implementation of effective early grade reading programs. We know many of you have been doing this work for many years already, so we understand too that programs have already been implemented in some cases for several years. So we hope this information is also useful to those of you who have been implementing programs and are looking to hear about what other initiatives are doing, are possibly modifying and expanding your programs to larger areas or to include more topical areas. So it is really designed with a diverse range of implementation and program needs that we know are out there. Each session is focused on a key technical topic and includes a summary of research around that area, experiences for early grade reading programs, and best practices to date. And throughout this webinar series, of course, we're going to have opportunities for you to share your experiences and to discuss them. We'll be touching on cross-cutting issues such as gender equity, technology, inclusive education throughout the different webinars. We know these are really important issues to members of the community of practice, and they are increasingly important as well to USAID, who from the USAID education policy, as you may have seen already, is really emphasizing that programs pay more and more attention to issues of equity and inclusive education in particular. We're also going to discuss monitoring, evaluation, expansion, and sustainability issues in projects. We know that these are areas that organizations, country governments, and the donor community is really keen to better understand and to be able to address in programs, as again, they have been implemented for several years. And as I mentioned, although this is a webinar with many, many people spread out around the world, we really want this to be an opportunity for interaction amongst you. And while we are not able to allow people to speak during the webinar, we are going to take a lot of time to pause and allow you to interact with us via the chat function, to share your questions, to get direct answers from the presenters, as well as our colleagues around the world who also can answer questions and share experiences and expertise. So we look forward to hearing from you. And in the previous webinar series that we did in November, we really enjoyed all of the comments and questions and lively discussion that we had. So just a quick summary of the webinars that are coming up, as you will see on your screen. Today we're going to kick off with a general introduction to early grade reading programming. We're going to talk about what we need to think about starting in the initial conception phases, but then as we continue to implement, modify, and expand our programs, what are all these things we need to be thinking of? What have we learned to date in terms of what's working, but where are the gaps also, so that we can think about those gaps as we talk about resources for teaching early grade reading on July 10th, as we think about what strategies we're using to teach early grade reading skills and assess them as well, which will be on July 17th. We've heard from many of you how language is such an important issue in early grade reading programs, and we're going to dive into that issue in particular on July 24th. And then we'll wrap up the webinar series on July 30th with a discussion on continuous professional development in early grade reading programs. And that will include looking at teacher training from pre-service to in-service, ongoing coaching support that we know teachers need, and also thinking about how do we provide professional development to the many other educators and administrators that play an essential role in early grade reading programs. So if you haven't already registered for those, you can go to the Global Reading Network's website, click on the events tab at the top, and it'll take you to where you can register for those. So I'd like now to introduce my colleague, Amy, who will be presenting today with me. Amy has more than 25 years of experience working in education program development, specifically in international program implementation as well, with a focus on literacy, government capacity building, and cross-cutting social development models. She's based in Tanzania, where she works as an independent education consultant. Amy first joined the Global Reading Network and Reach as a technical consultant in 2016 and has played an essential role in the production of resources and training programs like this. She has also worked for organizations including Creative Associates, the International Literary Association, the Global Center for Learning and Innovation, and World Learning. She's been a technical advisor for various U.S. government reading programs in Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, Nepal, and the Philippines. So she's got a global set of experiences in her pocket that she will be sharing with us throughout the webinar series. Amy was previously the vice president of a U.S.-based educational professional development organization called the Collaborative for Teaching and Learning, and she has been a literacy assessment specialist as well. She earned her Master's of Education as a clinical reading specialist from the University of Louisville, and she has additional training in program evaluation and program management. So we welcome Amy and her breadth of experience to this webinar series. Amy, welcome.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks very much. It's good to see so many people online today. It's my pleasure to also introduce your lead presenter today, Allison Flepson. Allison is the Reach Reading Program Specialist. She supports the design and development of resources and professional development opportunities for the Global Reading Network. Ms. Flepson Allison has 15 years of experience designing and managing education-related programs in sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to joining Reach, Allison worked for 6 years at RTI International, where she helped design and implement a number of early grade literacy programs, assessments, training guides, and resources. And one area of particular interest to her is this issue of language use in education, which she talked about briefly in the overview, especially as it relates to reading and early language learning. So I'm happy to be with you all here today. And I think we're going to kick off with section 1. But before we do, let's take a look at the session objectives for the day. As Allison noted, this first session is really an overview session where we're looking at the importance of the early grade reading initiatives in terms of improving all learning outcomes over time for children, the relationship between early grade reading initiatives and how that really has an impact on quality education in general. We'll take a look at the progress that we've made with early grades reading programs to date, and also some of the gaps that still exist. Focus on the cross-cutting issues, gender, equity, technology, etc., and then steps and considerations as you develop early grade reading programs and look at the concepts of how do you expand and scale, particularly focusing on this idea of planning for the end in mind, which means at the beginning of program implementation to really be thinking about expansion, scale, and sustainability. Today, we're going to be asking you to really interact as much as possible. There will be particular activities throughout the webinar where we will ask you questions. We're also going to be asking you to look at particular documents. Section 1 deals with our progress that we've made globally in terms of implementation and results for early grades reading programs, and also the gaps that continue to exist that need to be addressed as we move really internationally into phase 2 of this kind of work. So in getting started, one of the first things we want to look at and talk about is this relationship between reading and literacy. For many, many years, we've talked about global reading programs and reading programs implemented by national ministries of education in different countries, reading programs implemented by external large-scale donor programs as well. One of the things that has really been noted over the years is that even inside these existing reading programs, we can't really separate reading from the larger issue of literacy. So you will hear us today talk about reading and literacy really interchangeably because reading is really a major component, but it's only one component of what leads to true literacy for young learners, which includes also the implementation of integrated speaking and listening strategies, the relationship between reading and writing. All 4 of these things really build sets of literacy skills that enable students to learn over time and hone those literacy skills over time. It also involves the integration of critical thinking for the production of more critical thinking and use of technology skills in order to move literacy skills forward. So as we continue today, you will hear us talk about reading, you will hear us talk about literacy. We're focused really on the entire gamut of skills that's related to that large body of skill set. So one of the first issues is why early grades reading? Evidence exists in overwhelming numbers that the reading skills of children in low-income country contexts continue to be extremely low. They've been extremely low for many years, and while we're making an impact, that impact, as you'll see a bit later in the webinar, is still quite small. We all also know that reading is a critical skill set that really impacts children's ability to learn across different disciplines and to learn over time. And when we see children exit the formal education system too early, and when we look further on into their longer lives, their ability to participate in formal economies, their ability to support families and to be a productive citizen, the lack of reading skills and the lack of literacy skills really is a huge barrier for people to have full engagement in the opportunities that come to them in their lives. And we know if they don't learn to read in very early grades, that they just continue to fall further and further behind over time. And this has been kind of captured in this idea from Torgerson called the Matthew effect. And so we're going to take a look at the Matthew effect just briefly. So the Matthew effect is really a very simple concept, and it's a logical concept that children who learn to read in early primary move forward more rapidly in terms of their overall reading achievement and their overall ability to learn than students who do not learn to read in early primary. And in fact, the gap not only exists, but over time that gap gets larger and larger and larger until essentially those students who have not learned to read in early grades fall behind other students in pretty much every single area of learning. So as we go through today and through this webinar, we want you to really be thinking about your own program work. So in your own programs, if you think about this Matthew effect, how does your program work to confront the Matthew effect in terms of its design? Do you have elements in the design that ensure there's early capture and support for students who are at risk of falling behind? In terms of implementation, a system for monitoring and providing intervention for those students? And inside your classroom models, what happens at the classroom level to be able to identify, intervene, and support those children who are at risk of falling behind more and more over time? So take a minute, if you would, because I think we do have time. to think about this Matthew effect and think about your own program, go to the chat box and see, share with us, please, anything that you're thinking about in terms of your own program and some of the things you may have done to try and get in front of this issue of the Matthew effect. So we've got a question from Irina about how the trend continues past schooling age. And one of the things we do know, particularly with girls in early grades, the effect of low literacy skills on girls as they grow into women, they marry, they have families, they have children. Those effects not only hit them economically in terms of their overall ability through lifetime to produce economically for their own families and participate in the formal economy, but it also has an influence on up to 2 generations of their future family. Women who are learning to read as girls in early grades have a much better track record in terms of keeping their own children in school, having healthy children who survive young childhood, and children who are much better educated and participate in formal economies as well. So we have a question also about why preschool is not included. These data simply here for the Matthew effect from Torgerson did not address preschool. So anyone online who would like to posit an idea about if we carry this back into the preschool level and we look at those pre-reading literacy skills, you know, the early pre-reading development of skills, any comments or any data to share, any program experience about this issue of preschool? Gap in grade 2 is not as big in grades 4. Yeah, the gaps grow over time. So for example, take a look at grade 1. You have small differences in students who are building skills. These are those very, very early skills in areas of phonics, in areas of phonemic awareness, and early frequently used vocabulary development. As you move into grade 2, then 3, then 4, up in 5 and 6, you can see the gap continues to grow. The reason the gap continues to grow is because if we have a lack of those early pre-reading basic skills, as children move into use of more complex text, they move into use of more complex skills. The lack of those early foundational skills has a bigger impact on the struggling learner in order to be able to keep up. So essentially, if they don't get those first year early skills, they continue to fall behind because developing those skills becomes harder and harder over time. So that's the fundamental of the Matthew effect, that if there is a skills gap early on, that kind of black hole of skills, that gap of skills, has a significant influence on children, and the influence grows more as the child grows older and deals with more complex interaction in schools. Let's take a look at some of the things that are going on internationally in terms of supporting this issue of early grades reading improvement. So we know we began with the Millennium Development Goals a number of years ago, now really over 12, 13 years ago, that really addressed trying to make access for children, access to schools, access to school buildings, more teachers, more resources. It was about getting the situation in place in order to enable some growth for children. That moved into the Sustainable Development Goals, which naturally shifted in many ways from that access issue to learning outcomes. And so the SDGs now really are focused on this qualitative issue, the issue of quality for students and the quality of learning outcomes for students. USAID has really been at the forefront of trying to get at that issue. How do you move from opening the doors and ensuring there are people there to meet the needs of children to how do you move to the next level to ensure that the quality of education is what it needs to be, that it's customized and designed to meet the needs of those students in that context in terms of language of instruction, in terms of the resources provided, in terms of the kinds and level of training that teachers have in order to take children from the access point to the performance point. There's a number of other donor agencies that also focus on this as well, and you can see those on the screen. And as we move to the next screen, I do want to go back and address a question that came up toward the end of this Matthew effect discussion. In a case where a learner doesn't learn to read by grade 2, how can we help him or her? And there's a lot of help to be had for those students, is the first thing to know. And that includes things like making sure there's a variety of level of materials available. So if students are struggling to access the generally available materials at beginning of, say, grade 3, that those teachers continue to have access for materials that are more easily accessed by children at a lower level reading materials that still contain similar content. There's also a lot of programs that are focused now on in-class intervention or multiple tiers of intervention, teachers being trained how to intervene in an integrated way inside their classroom, also additional external supports for students. But this is the big question, and it's a big question for all teachers in any context. When a student falls behind, how do you maintain forward motion for all students in your classroom and yet continue to support those students who are struggling? So we asked the question, why is USAID focused on improving early grade reading? We've talked about this really so far, but I want to reference you to the landscape report on early grades reading, and this is available at the GRN website. It really pulls together a lot of information about what's been done, why it's been done, what needs to be done. And USAID knows that the bottom line is early intervention with early skills development not only improves educational outcomes over time, but it fundamentally improves lives in the long run. So one of the ways in which this gets supported by USAID and by the US government is the READ Act, Reinforcing Education Accountability in Development, which became law in 2017. And it builds on the existing efforts of the US government to make sure that millions, hundreds of millions of children who are still not in school get in school. And then to improve the quality of education, not only for those children, but for those who are already enrolled in school. And then to build sustainability. And this is this issue of releasing countries to full independence of implementation. One of the success factors in terms of investing time and lots of funding in making sure this happens is to reach towards sustainability and independent implementation. And so you will see as we move forward a lot of discussion about not only scale, but about sustainability of programs as well. Another document that you could find interesting to view and take a look at is the U.S. government strategy on international basic education, which is a very recent document. It supports the READ Act and it coordinates a number of different efforts across the U.S. government. One of those being to improve learning outcomes, as we talked about on the previous screen, but then also expanding access, and particularly in this new government strategy, expanding access to marginalized and vulnerable populations. And when we talk about marginalized and vulnerable populations, we're talking about those cross-cutting issues of gender equity. We're talking about students who live in crisis and conflict zones, where the enabling environment around them is damaged or weak, and focusing in on those areas where the most vulnerable have the least access and where we can implement strategies that will help students improve their learning outcomes over time. Also, something that came out within the last year is the USAID education policy. And there is also a program cycle and implementation guide that accompanies this strategy. And the strategy that came out, it's November of 2018, has some particular emphases that really were not emphasized a lot in the prior strategy. And it is this issue of marginalized and vulnerable children and youth. That's one, making sure that we know where they are, we know who they are, we know what has them in a marginalized or vulnerable situation, addressing those situations and making sure they have an equitable pathway to a quality education. Also, while early focus was on reading and literacy, we're now looking at kind of a confluence of 3 sets of core basic skills for young children, not only literacy, but also early numeracy and the social emotional skills that they need to be productive in the classroom, to be safe in the classroom, to be able to access the learning opportunities that are available to them. So as we move forward, not only talking about literacy, but also more integrated approaches where literacy, numeracy, and social emotional skills are woven together into early learning. And there's a number of documents coming out from USAID to support this particular strategy as well. Another key policy shift and change, more emphasis, is this issue on gaining skills for productive lives. And this suggests kind of workforce development. And we're not just talking about workforce development for those older learners who are preparing to enter the workforce in their community soon, but we're talking about building in those kinds of life preparation skills from the beginning and all the way through. Another good emphasis in the new policy is on higher education institutions. And this is about preparing them for a different kind of learner. Hopefully, as students move through more productive learning opportunities, they will come to higher education as a different kind of learner with better capacity. But also looking at higher education institutions in terms of preparing teachers. So it's a nice circular loop from early grades literacy and numeracy development all the way up to how do we prepare people to be productive members of society. So as we look at the kinds of components that we have to address as people who design and implement literacy programs, one of the new things that has come out from USAID is their Reading Matters framework. And so the Reading Matters framework really is structured, of course, around children and around making sure children have the skills that they need. It also includes these critical components. So if you're looking at any kind of design or implementation for a literacy program, one of the things that we would really encourage you to do is to take a look at your program from the perspective of each of these different components. From administrators, what kind of support is provided for administrators and by administrators in program implementation? How do we prepare teachers effectively to be providing quality instruction in the classroom? How do we get the kinds of texts and materials into the classroom that are needed and are of good quality? The extra practice issue, which is critically important. How do we make sure that students have the time and the supports and structures for extra practice around literacy skills development outside of the classroom? Implementing regular assessment. It goes back to the early question about what happens to those students who are falling behind in terms of the Matthew effect. Regular assessment that goes from kind of daily continuous assessment to periodic stock taking for students, along with structures and strategies to intervene, is what's really going to make sure that Matthew effect shrinks and that all students are able to move forward. Doing all of these things based around normed and supported standards that are evidence-based, that also are linked into national policy, making sure that there are clear and high standards for teacher instruction and student learning, making sure that those are supported at a national level by policy and accountability, and making sure that they're all generally normed at the same level. If we have lower standards for teacher practice, we will see lower levels of teacher practice. If we have common standards for teacher practice and student learning, then we will see people moving toward that level in a more uniform way. And then another great piece here that we know has been present in early grades reading programs, but is now really being emphasized, is this issue of mentoring, ongoing coaching and mentoring. Those of us who do early grades program implementation know that training will take teachers only so far. Good resources will take them only so far. That continuous progress, continuous reflection on practice, and support for how to take the next step as a teacher is also critical. So as you move forward with your early grades programs, this is a great framework to take a look at and to check your work against, check your program design against, to see, are we really addressing all of these critical components and issues? So as you look across those particular components, there's also integrated throughout all of them these cross-cutting issues in terms of approaches to early grades reading programs. USAID's approach is that these programs need to be inclusive, including all children, and equitable for all children, regardless of who they are, regardless of their life circumstances, their ability, their skills. They all deserve an opportunity to learn to read. And so again, kind of regrouping, focuses on marginalized populations. These may be students with special needs. They may be students who are a minority population in their country. They could be marginalized due to geographic access issues. Also, gender equitable approach. And when we talk about gender equitable, most of us usually think about equal opportunity for girls. But there is also a gender equitable issue on the other side, given particular contexts. So we want to make sure that we are inclusive of boys and girls, that we are addressing their needs in the classroom in terms of instructional approaches, in terms of resource representation of them in the resources that they're using. So gender equitable, we need to be looking at both sides of that in terms of equitability. Also, children with disabilities and those children who are in emergency situations, who are in a conflict zone or a crisis zone, who may be removed from the standard education system, may require some support for temporary informal learning situations. For example, Syrian refugee children in multiple countries now in the Middle East, and how those countries are designing programs to deal with those emergency situations so that children are not losing those critical time periods where those early skills develop. And throughout the webinar, you'll see we've noted resources to help you learn more about those things. So to what has been accomplished so far. So from 2011 to 2017, 69.8 million children reached. So in terms of early grade reading program and the kinds of strategies, efforts, and initiatives that were out there, 69.8 million children reached. However, measuring outcomes for those children, the programs were really only able to measure outcomes for 28 million children. And so there's a second data point that's pending for more than 41 million children. Now, within the 28 million, look to the left side and work your way down to the next bar. For those 28 million children, we saw improved reading, that's statistically significant, proven improved reading for only 4 million. So that's really only 15% of those students who were actually measured. So there's been some improvement, but not the kind of improvement you might expect to see through large-scale efforts. And not the kind of measurement we might expect to see as well. There's a variety of reasons for the low levels of measurement, and there's a variety of reasons for the lack of improvement for a large portion of children. And so we're going to be taking a look at why some of that is taking place, and that's that issue of gaps. But before we do, I want us to kind of pause. I see a lot of chatting going on over in the chat box, and we're going to move you to a specific activity. Okay, so we're getting ready to we've looked at progress, we're getting ready to look at gaps. These are overall gaps that we're seeing across programs internationally. But we'd first of all like you to reflect on your own program. So we've shared with you the progress we've seen overall. We'd like you to think about and share with us what progress you are seeing. What do you think contributed to that progress? Because that's the big question. When we see progress and growth, we need to be able to say what it is that we think led to that progress, and that has to be shared with those who may be struggling to make progress. But then also, what are the gaps you're seeing? So think about that reading matters framework. Are there pieces there that are missing in your program? Are those related to gaps that you're seeing in your own program, places where things are not moving forward? Is that because of design? Is that because of implementation or context? And what ideas do you have to address those? We have an early comment from Nora on this about that the challenges that they're seeing are administrators and teachers. Nora, I'd like to ask you if you could further elaborate on that in terms of how administrators and teachers are providing a challenge to your program. and others who want to just let us know just briefly, what's the progress you're seeing? What do you think has contributed to that progress? And what are the gaps you're currently seeing in your own program work? Okay, so we have a comment from Sokoun that is really interesting. It's this idea that their program is really focused on the classroom literacy program, those 5 core skill sets, but yet doesn't reach out beyond the classroom levels, focusing on bringing the community in, parent support, community support, changing the actual environment that's provided for learning, and then measuring what it is that's happening, measuring the quality of teacher instruction as well as measuring the student performance. This really hits at some of the gaps that we know we're seeing. This is this issue of comprehensive program design, and that giving teachers the basic core information, teaching strategies and resources around those kind of 5 elements of early grades reading instruction is critical, but it does not move toward a larger program implementation that's really necessary to make sure the support network is in place for children. We also have a note from Sophia about how there are other kinds of aspects to literacy programs. For example, in Sophia's case, family literacy programs that can support early skills, but that some of these programs are not easy to evaluate. This is true. In many ways, it's much easier to do a sampling of children and give an early grades and early grades reading assessment and find out what's happening for children's performance. But when we take a look at those more qualitative aspects of programs, the people interaction kinds of things, the support networks kinds of things, even down to things like analyzing what types of resources are best used in a classroom, these are much more difficult, much more timely to evaluate. I think that with the comprehensive program design, so if we think back to the Reading Matters framework and the idea that we have to not only build in, but we have to constantly look at all of these elements of a comprehensive program, we see a lot of support today for looking at those difficult questions and measuring those things that are more difficult to measure. We've got some comments here on the issue of fragile contexts, where students are in and out of classrooms, whether it's due to conflict or health concerns. It does really make it quite difficult to continually provide a consistent education to children, to know what it is you're actually measuring over time. Focus, let's see, Nora talks about the issue of quality teachers in rural schools, the fatigue for teachers, also the teacher-student ratio, 1 to 100 in Nora's case. In my own case in Tanzania, we're looking at about 1 to 90, somewhere between 1 to 90 and 1 to 120. And that does create great difficulty. There are a lot of very specific strategies that can be used to manage this. I think one of the things we run into in programs is this issue of efficacy and the ability for programs to work with teachers and work within systems to build that sense of self-efficacy, that there are things that can be done. But there is also, again, the comprehensive issue. So we can't tackle student learning if we're not tackling all the other things that are either barriers or contributors. So either barriers to quality student performance or contributors to quality student performance as well. Barbara points out that a challenge is that school directors are covering a lot of different roles. And in some cases, in Barbara's case, this is due to a shortage of educators. And in other cases, this is due to a lack of clarity in the role of the school administrator. This is a very difficult challenge because, you know, we are charged in terms of program implementation to come up with strategies that can be long-term, sustainable, and implemented independently. So, for example, we might want to provide coaches in schools beyond a school director or beyond a head teacher or beyond a lead teacher. However, if we do that with external program funding that's not sustainable in the long term, we're setting up a coaching process that can't continue. And so it will not be able to be released to independence successfully and continue to exist. This is yet another example of how no one strategy works in a program without it being influenced by another barrier or being abetted, assisted by another access point. So working with government on policy, on funding allocation, long-range planning, teacher preparation, these are all critical factors that influence, one, how we should make decisions about program design, and two, the long-term sustainability of those programs as well. And James has noted some of these things using much more specific language than I have. The contextual issues, yeah? The accountability, how resources get diverted, teacher and pupil attendance. This is around efficacy, attitude, and understanding of importance. And then the motivation as well. NeuroNotes, time on task. For any of us who have been in a classroom doing classroom observations in programs, we know time on task is a continual issue. There's time in classroom, time in school, then time in classroom, then time on task. A lot of times what we're fighting in terms of time on task is kind of traditional methodologies in terms of what is school about and what is important to happen in the classroom. This is related in some ways to, I just had an experience observing in Ethiopian classrooms and interviewing school principals. And the school principals noted that in classrooms where our strategies were being implemented, the classrooms were noisy, the teachers were not at the front of the room, they weren't quite visible, the principal wasn't sure whether things were going on in the classroom. And this is a difference in point of view about what school should look like, what should happen in the classroom, how much time should be reserved for those kinds of traditions of schooling that are not related to education. So I think this time on task issue is a critical one. It's about reaching out to heads of school. It's about reaching out to teachers through training, giving good examples of what things should look like in the classroom, challenging carefully those kinds of norms in schools that actually interfere with time on task as well. So I want us to talk now about the gaps, and you've addressed many of them in your chat discussion, but we also have looked globally across a lot of programs to kind of pull together some of the common gaps that we're seeing. One of those is this issue of design and planning, that the kinds of activities that were designed for certain contexts did not always reflect that context, and were not always adapted and constructed within the authentic reality of the context. And so there ended up being kind of a lack of clear causal pathways between what was done and the effect of what was done, what caused what to happen, backed by evidence. So when we look at issues of design and planning, we can't reinvent the wheel with each program, and we should not. But we always need to take a look at what are the kinds of approaches that are available and tested out there, not only within our own context and not only within our own organizations, but broadly. And then what will adapt well into our specific context, what will not, and how do we link between what we choose to do and the unintended or intended results of those things. Another gap is in terms of instruction and skills. I mean, basically, we look at the numbers and we can see from the assessment of students that the gains were really small. The gains were small for children. The effect sizes were low. The numbers of students that showed statistically significant gains were still small. So we have a lot more work to do. Resources, in terms of resources for teaching and learning, there are delays in production. There are still problems with the supply chain management, getting those resources into classrooms. I think there was a lot of growth in the first 5 or 6 years of this major push to produce resources in context, to produce good quality resources, and also to train people at the local level to produce their own resources. But we have difficulty getting those into classrooms. And it links back into the instruction and skills because there's also difficulty then getting teachers to use them in a way that actually positively influences student learning. CPD, continuous professional development. in terms of implementation, there were issues with implementing a continuous approach to professional development. There's also a lack of evidence to date about how it is effective. This links to this causal pathway. Everyone has the sense that, for example, providing ongoing mentoring and coaching, whether that's externally supported, whether it's a peer-to-peer kind of coaching, we all have a sense that continued professional discussion and reflection on instruction will improve instruction. But to date, we have a lack of evidence to actually know that that is the case. Okay, so addressing the cross-cutting issues, there has been little information coming forward about these cross-cutting issues and how to manage these cross-cutting issues, even though we have some small number of activities and programs that were implemented to deal with them. We don't have much evidence, although we have seen that interventions related to gender, in terms of intervening on behalf of a particular gender, specific strategies intended to create a more level playing field for gender, were the most successful. We had a participant note early on this issue of family literacy programs, issues of community engagement. We have very little information to let us know about how these kinds of initiatives actually affect student learning. This could be because those initiatives, while present, weren't deeply evaluated. Sometimes they're difficult to evaluate because it's about perspective and point of view. It's also happening at the very, very local level, so gathering data can be difficult. But we have very little evidence to know the effect of these kind of formalized, emphasized community engagement activities. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, trying to build ministry-housed monitoring and evaluation systems, this was generally not very successful. This goes to the issue of accountability and also in terms of pushing on policy, but it also goes to the issue of independent implementation, release to national independence for programs, and continued systems in place in order to make sure programs continue to happen. They're supported in terms of policy from government. They're supported in terms of monitoring and evaluation and accountability. And when we look at the way in which activities were packaged in terms of design, they didn't actually allow for evaluation of the specific components. So unpacking these program packages and taking a look at the different components, how they influence the larger effectiveness of the program was an issue. Then cost effectiveness is a specific issue as well. How to measure the cost effectiveness of specific aspects of interventions. Sustainability and scale up. Evaluations of existing programs showed little evidence of government's ability to take over its own reading interventions. Now, this is a long-term issue. Part of it we can see is because programs may not have really planned upfront with independence, scale up, and sustainability in mind. Part of it is because change is slow, and the further up in government that you reach and the larger those complex issues become, the more difficult it is to move that entity forward in terms of taking on its own work, making change in point of view and understanding at those levels. So we've got issues with knowing how to make sure scale up and sustainability can happen successfully. Okay, I'm going to hand you over to Allison at this point.
Here, thank you, Amy, for that great overview of so many of the important issues that we've already had to grapple with and looking at the gaps as we now take us into the next part of our webinar on key steps for developing a quality early grade reading program. We realize that this is a really large topic and we could spend days on it, and we are going to circle back to it in the subsequent webinars when we talk about the specific component areas like teacher professional development, development of reading materials. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the broader global issues that we need to think about when we're developing programs, when we're modifying them and expanding them. So before we do that and jump into some of those steps and considerations, we thought it would be useful to think about the characteristics first of effective programs, because we know that these are really what underpins all of what we do, and no matter what kind of program we design, we have all the perfect elements to it. If we don't have some of these underlying characteristics, our programs aren't going to be effective. And so some of these might be so intuitive to us, we don't really think about them, but we do want to bring our attention to them specifically in your programs. And I think some of you have already called out a few of them in some ways in your questions and comments. The first one being good leadership. So those involved in designing and implementing programs need to be able to influence others, and that includes all the stakeholders involved in supporting early grade reading improvement, whether it's administrators, parents, teachers themselves, teachers unions, all those important groups. They need to be able to effectively manage program partnerships, the personnel, the activities. So it's important that we take stock of leadership in our programs. I think a lot of programs have realized sort of midway or towards the end that maybe leadership is lacking in a particular institution or government entity that's essential, or they may not have it in certain aspects of their program team. And so taking stock of leadership, identifying areas of strengths and potential weaknesses, but also cultivating leadership, thinking of that as a key area of capacity building, that it's not just around, capacity building is not just around materials development or teacher training, it's even about the leadership that's really essential for the success and the eventual sustainability of programs. Alongside this, we have the need for collaboration, the need for establishing processes, tools, and norms for collaboration, and also communication. If you have examples of these, we'd love to hear about them in the chat box, because we, again, often think of sharing our resources and examples, our teaching and learning materials, or our teacher training guides. But we don't necessarily share how we sort of facilitate these important issues like collaboration and communication. What are some best practices you might have come up with in your programs for making sure that government, implementing partners, and different institutions are all on the same page, collaborating and communicating well. Another important characteristic of effective programming is using evidence-based approaches. And not just that they're evidence-based and that they've worked in one place, but that they've also been contextually adapted. We'll talk more about what some of the evidence-based approaches are in specific contexts, but as you know, one size doesn't fit all. So we'll also talk about the importance that we know there is for countries and programs to adapt to their specific context. Lastly, we know that effective programs conduct continuous and rigorous quality assurance. This means they staff programs with qualified technical specialists, and they build the capacity internally of their team on an ongoing basis. They establish and use quality assurance processes and tools across components. We'll be sharing some of these in the different webinars, but again, we're always interested in hearing from you about what you found as a way to ensure quality across your different components and activities. They allow sufficient time and resources to monitor, to evaluate, to conduct the research that they need to verify that what they're doing is working well. But then they analyze the results, they modify their program course, they communicate those findings with the different partners that need to be aware of them. So quality assurance is a key characteristic of those programs. And in the chat box, if there's anything else that you have found to be essential in effective programming, again, please take a minute to share it, because we'd really be interested in hearing from you what are those underlying qualities that really matter for achieving our goals. I see that Nura has talked about a technical working groups with government officials from the Ministry of Education who take the lead. Nura, I think that's a great idea. I know various programs have been doing that. So government is not just a group that's consulted periodically after plans may have been made, but actually takes the lead in charting that roadmap for the program and contributing and leading technical work. Alongside that, Amy mentioned that ongoing working groups. These might be groups that tackle different topics based on expertise. That way, people within the government, if programs are handed over for governments to take them forward, those people have the knowledge and experience to do so. Tin also shared having space and time for teachers to reflect on their interventions. So that is a really useful teacher professional development practice. Sophia mentions a new one I haven't heard of, a Moodle online platform to build a community of practice. Sophia, I don't know if that sounds like it's specific to a country, and any resources you want to share with the group or later with us at the GRN, we'd love to hear more about how that is going within a specific country. And Nora talks about disseminating findings from evaluations. And we know that's so important to also have the information shared using the appropriate means of communication, languages, to different groups, whether it's parents or government officials. So keep those ideas coming, and I hope others may have thought about something in their own program that if you're missing one of these, what might you be able to do to enhance it to ensure the success of your program. So we'll jump into some of these steps, and again, we know that there are so many of them and we could spend days talking about them. So we've tried to distill these into some very overarching steps and considerations, and we hope to hear throughout as we go through this about kind of the various subtasks and activities that have been important to you. So as we've already mentioned, collaboration is key. So assembling the planning and design team as soon as possible is really, really essential. This team should include country education authorities, as well as representatives from different branches within the government, however that is structured in your context. Their involvement in the planning stage is really critical to obtain consensus on the need for a program, its focus, its specific activities. Involving education officials and actors at all levels is important, as this will surface many important issues, needs, constraints, and opportunities that you can then address at the program design phase rather than when you're already implementing and you encounter various obstacles that you might have already figured out if those people had been more integrally involved in the design phase. Working in collaboration with government education leaders also helps to lay the groundwork for approvals you need along the way as a program team for scale up and also eventually sustaining your program, hopefully. Technical experts, including reading specialists, linguists, monitoring and evaluation specialists, all of those people help to identify an appropriate approach for reading outcomes, help to draft curriculum and materials, can advise on appropriate ways of assessing children's reading skills across different languages. Teacher professional development experts, and the list goes on. And sometimes we consult them on an ad hoc basis, but really bringing them together as a collaborative team to see how they can talk to each other and feed off each other's expertise is essential. Programs should always seek to involve teachers, teacher educators, and parents. This is a group that sometimes is missed at those higher levels of planning, where people often assume they know what teachers need and want. But teachers' direct involvement in the form of focus groups and field visits and other means of involving them in materials design or other aspects of the program can help to understand their needs, their challenges, attitudes and beliefs that might affect whether or not they use your materials or engage with the teacher professional development offered. They can share suggestions and ideas. Experts in monitoring, evaluation, and research can provide input right away into the design phase. They can, for example, suggest a staggered approach to the program rollout as appropriate to assess it in the way that's needed. They can also help them to understand program components and how it will be best to monitor and evaluate them, which will, of course, in turn affect your budget, and that's good to know sooner rather than later. Program managers and other staff responsible for day-to-day implementation of a program who are familiar with the context are also vital members. They can ground truth ideas, suggest activities, help suggest feasible approaches. So if in your program that's already underway right now, you have some suggestions on things you did at that initial planning stage or things you didn't do, which now, several years into your program, you think it would have been good if we had done this, please share those in the chat box. And Amy will be responding to some of those comments or questions as I continue on, and we will circle back to some of them here once we have a few in the chat window. It's important to note that a design team can be dynamic. We don't need to necessarily think of this as something that happens only at the beginning. It's one and done, as they say, that certain people can be identified to plan different aspects. You can have a core team that follows the program throughout. As Amy mentioned, working groups can be timely groups that come in when needed and are perhaps phased out. But the government personnel involvement is always key across that to help ensure that they are truly partners in the process of developing and implementing early grade reading programs. And lastly, I just wanted to mention the important role that assigning clear roles and responsibilities to those involved in planning and design teams mentioned technical working groups as well, like making it clear what is expected from people's involvement. Is it just coming to a workshop? Is it then contributing on an ongoing basis to design, planning, and materials development? It really helps to set those expectations and make people feel like their involvement is essential. So as Amy, you were commenting on the importance of building skill sets and commitment of key country actors. I think that is something that starts during the design phase as we find out what people's skill sets are and what they what additional capacity development is needed throughout the program implementation phase. So I'm going to move on to talk more about what is needed during that design phase, but also during expansion phases in terms of background information needs and research that we need to conduct. I'm calling this, or we're calling this a literacy landscape assessment here because REACH, in collaboration with USAID and the Global Reading Network, is developing a toolkit that we're calling a literacy landscape assessment to provide really detailed guidance on all the information that we do need to collect and the background research we need to do to inform programs. So I have one slide here on this, but there's a whole resource toolkit that is being developed as we've seen how programs do need a more concise roadmap to inform the information that they're collecting and then how they're really using that information to design programs, because we know there's a lot of information that might be out there, but we don't always necessarily use it in a way to inform program design. So this assessment that we're calling the literacy landscape assessment is essential to understanding context and needs, and to identify the approaches and activities that will most likely be effective in achieving outcomes, namely improving teacher instruction and student reading skills. The experience across many programs to date has found that significant background research is needed across a range of topics in order for programs to be well designed from the beginning. It can take time to conduct the research. For those of you who have done that, you know that it can take time and use valuable resources, but it can be tremendously useful in avoiding mistakes down the road. For example, language mapping in Ghana and Mozambique has recently helped to identify what languages should be used in specific schools for teaching reading in multilingual classrooms, and what therefore specific strategies are needed to support learners' language needs. And while of course language mapping is an involved process that can take time and of course requires some financial investment, it's extremely important so that we train teachers in the appropriate skills and get the right materials into the right classrooms. So all of this data that's gathered can help ground decisions about policy and practice in the realities in the field. A list of research to conduct and information to collect can be found in handout 1. If a program has not yet conducted all of these suggested background research, it's really never too late. Many programs are undertaking studies, midway, even after an initial program has been implemented, to gather it, to go back to inform ongoing program development. The next slide here, an activity and discussion that we're going to have. So once you have the handout up, specifically when you look at that list, what topics did you actually gather information on? How did you gather it? How was it used to inform program design? And if there's some areas you didn't gather information on, what now as you've been implementing your program perhaps did you realize, oh, we should have collected that? I would highly recommend groups to collect this information. And is there anything else you would add to this list? So some of the information that of course is essential when you're designing a program or expanding it is to really understand current learning outcomes and the general state of education. What are children's literacy and other skills? We know we have a number of early grade reading assessment tools, and these are continually being adapted and modified depending on the context, the language, and now we have more and more results from those, and the GRN website and EduLinks and the US government STEC website has lots of reports from these different reading assessments. The early grade reading barometer, which you'll see mentioned in the handout here, is also a place where you can go to see data on different countries' reading assessment results, but really understanding where the kids are and what are the skills that they really need additional support to learn is essential. Programs sometimes find that they need to focus on specific skills and help teachers to teach those skills better than necessarily taking on the entire gamut of all reading skills. And it can also help to pinpoint where the gaps are from grade to grade. Teacher workforce characteristics is number 3 there. You'll see more and more programs are really gathering information on teachers. How long are they staying at schools? What are their skill sets that they bring already to classrooms that are assets that can be built on when you're designing teacher professional development? Some of you talked about student-teacher ratios, and many programs I have talked to are really looking at this teacher attendance issue along with student attendance to understand the amount of exposure that students are actually having to teachers and how can we boost teacher attendance and also grapple with the issue of teacher mobility and attrition. So these are not necessarily pieces of information that programs are gathering initially, but they're finding more and more that it has such an important impact on instruction in the classroom that we need to have a better understanding of the teacher workforce that we are dealing with in these programs. Alongside this is teacher knowledge, instructional practices, and language skills. And Barbara, thank you. You just hit that one right in your comment that I see came in a minute ago. Programs know that teachers come sometimes not very well prepared in the classroom. They may not have had the background in early grade literacy instruction. Most often they haven't. They may not even speak the language that they've been assigned to teach. So more and more programs have been developing instruments to help understand what teacher knowledge gaps there are, what assets they bring to the table to inform the professional development that is offered, which we'll have a webinar just on that. And if you have instruments that you've used to assess teacher knowledge, instructional practices, and language skills, or if you've done qualitative studies in classrooms, we'd really be interested in getting those because we see that's a big gap in what's available publicly for the community of practice to learn from. School enrollment, attendance information, we know that can be challenging to get accurate information, and programs are often in search of it throughout their program to get accurate information, so they're delivering the right number of books to schools and understanding whether kids are showing up on a regular basis. Teaching and learning materials, we'll talk about that in a whole webinar, but understanding what's available and what we can build on in our program so we're not necessarily starting everything from scratch. Number 7, language-related information and data. Again, this has been an issue that we've heard so much from the community of practice that we'll have a whole webinar on it. So lots of language-related information and data from language mapping studies, assessments of children in different languages, using different types of assessments so that we're understanding language skill level across different oral language and other important issues when we have to think about the instruction that we're offering in bi or multilingual classrooms. And lastly, equity. Some of you may have heard of the equity initiative that Save the Children and FHI 360 have been spearheading for the past couple of years, but it's more and more important, as we see from the USAID policy, that we are understanding if the programs are reaching all children, what children, the most marginalized and vulnerable children, what is the impact of programs on those groups. So disaggregating data, figuring out where inequity still exists is really important. And as I mentioned, the forthcoming resource on this will walk you through many of these issues even more in depth than this handout does, but it's just important to have this list again at the design phase to think about how your program is collecting information and using it to inform design. James Statman, thank you for the comment about education system finance. That's a really, really important issue, and you know programs aren't always tasked with doing this as much as maybe in the past they used to around figuring out resource flows, what money actually reaches the districts and the schools, are teachers paid on time. These are all such important issues when you're thinking about motivation for teachers to show up in the classroom, and you're thinking about the ongoing sustainability of programs if, of course, the money is not getting to where it should be. A program can't be successful or sustained in the future. So thank you for adding that. So let's move on to talk about number 3, the education system mapping and capacity assessment. So alongside what we're calling the literacy landscape assessment, design teams or teams that have already designed their program but are expanding it really need to have a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the various institutions and individuals in the education system that will play a part in early grade reading improvement. So that includes units or divisions responsible for curriculum development, student assessment, development of teaching and learning materials, procurement and distribution of them, teacher in-service and pre-service preparation, education finance and budgeting, as James just mentioned, and monitoring and evaluation. So it's a lot, and I think in the earlier days of early grade reading programs, we really thought more just about teacher training and resource development, and as we see how early grade reading programs, the spokes of it touch on just the entire whole system, the education system, we realize that we need to have an understanding of the capacity of these groups and all the related issues to be successful. So it's important to know who does what, how the units interact or perhaps don't interact the way they should, who are the change agents, what are the change impediments. We know that within the government there's often a lot of changeover. So if that's just the status quo and not something that you may not be able to always influence, what does that mean for a program? What can still be successful perhaps when you have a lot of turnover, and what might not be successful? There are, of course, lots of resources on organizational capacity assessment, or OCA, and USAID has some on their website, and we reference some in the references. So the information should be used to inform who is involved in design and implementation and what a program needs to provide in terms of capacity development to very specific institutions and individuals. And again, if anything I'm talking about here is resonating with you, a great experience you've had, a difficult one you've had that you can share, please do so in the chat, and you don't have to wait necessarily for a pause to do that. Developing or refining your approach and activities, it's great, right? It entails a lot of tasks. Design and refinement is iterative in nature, and it overlaps with other activities like developing your budget, your monitoring and evaluation plan, which we'll also get to. The first aspect of this step that I want to emphasize again and again is this meaningful engagement with all relevant stakeholders throughout the planning process. Nora, I think, has been sharing some really uplifting examples of really engaging people from the beginning in the process so they understand what early grade reading is and what the importance of it and what their role can be. As you said, Nora, at some point, allowing people to share without any right or wrong answers so that they are involved in the process. So not just an initial discussion, followed later, 5 months down the road when there's a set of activities that's about to get underway that you'd like, the government to approve, or you'd like the involvement of another organization. It's ongoing, it's collaborative. Setting program objectives. Sometimes this isn't always clear across the different partners. What does the program hope to accomplish? And you might realize 2 years down the road when your status report comes out that not everyone had the same understanding of what you were going to accomplish and by when. So these objectives need to be defined based on a needs assessment, research, in-depth discussions with partners about what's feasible, what's realistic. No one should be in doubt about what the outcomes of the program are. And related to the identification of programs, of objectives, something that Amy talked about at the very beginning, and that USAID has already identified as a gap, is having a good theory of change and results framework. What are the causal pathways that will lead to change? We sort of have this idea in our minds that if we do this, then that will occur, and then this will occur, and that may be true in some context or if certain conditions are present, but what is the theory of change for your specific context? And really being explicit about stating that to those people involved. Then in a small bullet point here, something that we take months and years even to do, designing context-specific approaches and activities based on relevant evidence-based best practices. So we've talked and we'll continue to talk about what some of those evidence-based best practices are across different areas like teacher professional development and instruction of early grade reading. I want to emphasize again that those need to be context-specific though. Sometimes we get excited hearing, what might have worked in Kenya or what might have worked in Guatemala or what might have worked in another country. But we really need to understand why it worked, what were the particulars of that intervention and the conditions in that country that allowed it to be successful, and we need to think about whether that would be appropriate for our context. And not all programs necessarily put equal emphasis on equal things. Some may need to focus on teacher pre-service and in-service in a way that's not a focus in another country. So everything is very context specific within this idea that there are some general best practices and there are some components that we do need to have to improve early grade reading outcomes generally. Along with having those approaches be relevant, evidence-based, contextually appropriate, they need to be aligned. And because of the way sometimes projects are structured and ministries are structured, we sort of have these silos of development of resources, development of teacher professional development, a monitoring and evaluation plan, and parental engagement, et cetera. But this really has to be aligned. If those groups aren't all talking to each other and they're not complementary activities, both in terms of design and phasing and approach, it won't be successful. So I just want to emphasize that alignment. And of course, considering costs, something that we'll talk about when we think about budgeting, but I want to include it here so that cost analysis is seen and cost considerations are seen really as integral to the technical design and approach. We can't have the technical design run away without the train car related to cost. And also field testing and pilot testing of approaches. This can be at the very micro level when you're doing teacher professional development or resource development. We'll talk a bit about ground truthing, field testing of materials and specific approaches so that we don't have to design programs at such a large scale. Or we can even have programs that are already operating at quite a large scale that then do smaller field tests, trying out new things, concepts of proof, before we do it on a large scale, and that helps to inform design before we roll something out and realize all along that there were some things that could have been changed. And as you'll see in the box to the right, designing with scales and sustainability in mind. We know from the beginning sometimes what will be feasible in a context at a larger scale, and if a government is to be self-reliant. And so we need to think really at the beginning about what those parameters are, while at the same time, of course, understanding we do want to try some new things to see what would be cost effective. Continuing with the development of approaches and activities, I want to really highlight the issue of integrating cross-cutting issues, gender, equity, inclusion, conflicts of crisis. For those of you who have read the U.S. government's strategy for basic education and the USAID policy, these are really, really important cross-cutting issues that I think we were all happy to see get much more emphasis than have been. There's resources at the end of this presentation on those different topical areas, so you can find more information if you'd like, and we're going to be trying to touch on them throughout. I wanted to highlight one new resource from the Global Reading Network called the Universal Design for Learning to help all children read. You may have seen this already. We've presented it at the Comparative International Education Society's recent conference, and there's some upcoming trainings in August if you're interested in understanding how we can be designing our instructional approaches and our programs generally so that all children can benefit from them. So universal design is something really important, and I wanted to highlight this resource here. So agreement among stakeholders on all these critical issues that we've been talking about and will continue to throughout the webinar series is needed to inform your approach, your activities, and budget. I wanted to highlight a few here. So objectives, targets, and indicators, mentioned again, but it's so important that people get on the same page about what you're expecting to accomplish and by when. Languages to be used for reading instruction. Sometimes we take this for granted, that we are all on the same page also about languages to be used for reading instruction and when and how these languages will be taught. Something to really have consensus about early on. Skills to be taught in instructional approaches, and my colleague Adrienne Barnes will be talking in a few weeks about what are these key early grade reading skills, when do we need to teach them, how do we need to teach them, and programs need to understand which of those will be taught in their programs and emphasized at different points throughout the grades or in particular areas where they see those needs, where they see particular skills and instructional approaches are needed. Copyright and licensing of materials. When early grade reading work first began, I don't think anybody was thinking about these issues, and as we have developed more and more materials and are getting, seeing that there's a need for really addressing how materials are copyrighted, how they're licensed, more and more resources are now becoming available. The Global Reading Network has some already on our website, and they are in the reference sheet that you got to if you'd like to see recordings and to see some presentations already on the issue of open licensing, for example. You can also register for a GRN webinar on this topic. On June 27th, we actually have 2 webinars taking place, one for an Africa-based audience and one for Asia-Pacific audience. If that's where you're located, you might find some of the presenters and issues discussed relevant to your context. Excuse me, those are June 27th and July 18th. Materials to be developed and procured, another area that we really need consensus on, and sometimes don't find it exists until the ball's already rolling. And how program resources and results will be shared and with whom. It's really important to figure that out early on, and of course to keep adapting, but to make sure there's some consensus early on. I've encountered for numerous programs, for example, that programs have been operating for years, but the resources and results aren't shared necessarily with all program actors or necessarily even publicly, and that has been something that programs have struggled with because there wasn't consensus that that would be something that would happen. And lastly, equity inclusion issues. There's so much now out there being discussed about what approaches and activities and resources are appropriate, and we know there's still much more to be done, and this is often a challenging topic in countries where resources may not be sufficient to meet the needs of all children, but how is the program going to be addressing that issue short-term and potentially then, of course, long-term? I wanted to share maybe just a few of the chats. Some of you have probably been following along and read that. Amy mentioned that the Ethiopia Read 2 program is an example of a small-scale pilot currently testing a peer coaching model in a small number of schools before refining and implementing it. That's great to hear, Amy. We'll talk about in the presentation on coaching, a lot of programs are developing different models now. They've been doing something for a while, finding it may not be the most effective, and trying something new. So that flexibility and that openness to doing small-scale piloting and refinement is really important. So without getting too much in the weeds of budgeting and finance, we did want to highlight the importance of cost analysis. USAID is also realizing this is a really important issue, and just in 2018 and 19, they've released some resources on cost analysis that you might find useful. There are also links to them are in the references section. The topic is also going to be covered in the forthcoming resource, the Literacy Landscape Assessment Tool. But suffice to say that cost analysis first involves gathering information about costs of key inputs, and then analyzing these costs in different ways to understand, what's driving costs, what are the contextual factors about costs. Costs might not be the same even in neighboring countries, even within a country, as many of us know. Time sensitivity, beneficiary sensitivity, reaching children in harder to reach areas, reaching more marginalized populations or children with specific needs, of course, affects the cost. And so there's much more guidance now on how to think about costs and also to report about costs, which USAID is requiring, so that they can also better understand cost issues and cost effectiveness across programs. And I just wanted to call out those resources. And again, the importance of developing a budget hand in hand with the technical approach, and understanding of the resources needed to implement significantly affects what it can include. Some of the important considerations are listed there: the geographic location of your program, number of schools, how many languages you're going to be teaching in, teachers and students to include, monitoring and evaluation approach. What research studies do you want to do? Often programs get sort of midway and they think, well, we wanted to answer this question and find out this, but there's not a budget for doing some of that really important and interesting monitoring and research that can answer some of the important questions we have around teacher instructional quality, around coaching, just to name a few of the big ones that I think more is being done to try to get at some of the unknowns that we've had in early grade reading program implementation and effectiveness. Just going to call out some staffing considerations that I would love others to chime into as well, that I have personally experienced and heard from many others about staffing, and this influences budget, and this influences your technical approach as well. And the key one being, of course, having sufficient staff to successfully carry out the proposed work. We are realists. We understand that programs have limited finances, but certainly making sure now, as we've learned what it takes to implement programs, making sure we have enough people to develop materials, to continue to work with teachers, and to develop teacher professional development programs. That those people have the required skills and knowledge to do so. We know that there's a lot of professional development needs, not only amongst government partners, but also amongst the staff. And are we building into our plans and our designs opportunities for professional development to increase skill level and to help the people that need to be developing, designing, and continuing these programs have the skill level they need. And if some of you have recognized that in your programs and want to share anything that you've done differently, maybe second or third or fourth time around to deal with staffing considerations and constraints, please, we welcome that sharing. So moving to the last kind of key step in the process around developing, monitoring, and evaluating our programs. I say last, but I would like to maybe take that back, because developing monitoring, evaluation, and research plans really does go hand in hand with program design. It should include all the experts on a program, from the reading specialist to the M&E specialist to everyone else in between, so that they're all understanding what it will be monitored and evaluated, what the intended data is that you're going to be collected, what are we expecting to learn from monitoring and evaluation data, and what do those different specialists all need to know. So these plans can't be just designed by monitoring and evaluation specialists, but involve, for example, people involved in teacher professional development. Amy mentioned at the very beginning, a big gap in teacher professional development, and what we know works well is that programs aren't evaluating it well. They're not connecting it to changes in teacher practice and changes in student skill level. So thinking about working with our teacher PD specialists to come up with realistic and evidence-based plans for evaluating our teacher professional development approaches. Thinking of how we're designing programs to assess the relative impact of the different components like teacher PD is something that we can be doing a better job of, as we've seen across many programs who can't necessarily untangle whether the coaching had an added value in the terms of the teacher's professional development, because it wasn't necessarily evaluated separately from a greater package of early grade reading improvement. And embedding research into program plans. So I mentioned this just a little bit. Qualitative studies, longitudinal studies are really essential. A few programs I've heard are doing this, but there's just a great need out there, I think, within programs to do it even better. Some of these considerations in the right-hand box there around tracking fidelity of implementation in a way that we understand, are the results because something in our design was not effective, or is it really because it wasn't implemented with fidelity? That still is a big question in many countries and programs, and it's unfortunate because it would really help us to know if we need to correct the course of our technical approach, or if we need to figure out why programs aren't even being developed as we'd like them to in the first place. Another gap is metrics and outcomes on government capacity. Amy also mentioned this is one that USAID had noted early on, that we really need to understand capacity issues and how we can improve it, and whether as programs expand and we seek for them to be sustainable, whether there's the capacity in the different areas that we need to be. Cost effectiveness of activities, we're getting better at this, although just because the program has been evaluated for that and it's deemed cost effective, again, we need to be cautious always in what we take from one context to the other. And one size doesn't fit all. Sometimes we hear a lot about RCTs or specific type of a study, but different monitoring, evaluation, and research approaches and different instruments are needed across programs. But it would be a great start now if we could start sharing what we are using. And at the Global Reading Network, we're always happy to hear from you and to be able to incorporate your resources and your experiences into webinars like this. If you think about the key steps that we've just shared, we wanted to hear more from you on your own experiences. If you could share a brief story on any one of these 6 major steps that we know are important. What steps did you feel in particular need more attention in your work, or work you've heard about to inform ongoing implementation, the redesign of a program, or the expansion? Could just share something that might be an interesting lesson learned for others that they could take away. I'm going to turn it now back over to Amy, who's going to bring us into discussing issues of scale-up and sustainability.
Thank you very much. I am going to spend a brief amount of time talking about these issues of scale-up and self-reliance. A lot of times, you can move to the next screen. a lot of times when we talk about scale up and sustainability or self-reliance, we talk about them as kind of a package, but they're not the same thing, and they don't necessarily happen simultaneously or by magic. So scale up, what we're talking about here is the expansion of a program. And usually when we talk about scale up, it's not expansion into new elements of programs, but it's usually in terms of the size of the program and the number of the beneficiaries, the students that it reaches, the schools and the teachers that it reaches. Planning for scale up front is critical in terms of making sure that a program design works its way towards scale up over time. Also self-reliance. When we talk about sustainability, we're really talking about self-reliance. The concept that a national program can rely on its own knowledge and skills, its own financial structures, its own operational structures to continue the work beyond the scope of external intervention, to be self-reliant in long-term implementation. And it's important to keep in mind, you can scale up a program and not move that program to self-reliance. So in terms of all of the steps in planning and design that Allison talked about in the last section, it is critical that these two issues, both scale up and self-reliance, be dealt with in early design of programs and dealt with independent of one another, since they really are not answered through the same set of strategies. So when we look at scale up, there are some key characteristics. One, we've talked about a lot today, planning scale up from the outset. If we don't plan from the outset, we will find that our numbers in the end are not where we want them to be, and scale up becomes impossible. Getting those leaders in place and the champions in place that can legitimize and support the innovation from the very beginning, working in partnership with those folks, working in partnership with ministries of education to build skills, build commitment, build motivation, and turn over skills, strategies, and operations slowly and over time, which of course suggests we've got to have genuine collaboration and coordination. Not just sharing of information with government entities, but collaborating from the beginning in the design, in the decision-making, in data analysis and reflection, and the continuous data that's coming in about a program, making decisions as partners. Also, being able to be flexible in terms of the adaptation of programs. Not all programs, even within a particular country context, are going to work in every situation and everywhere. And so what are the kinds of things we can look at throughout program design and implementation where there are some areas of flexibility or adaptation of particular elements that maintain fidelity to the core standards, principles, and content of the program, but allow for flexible adaptation. This is also an interesting idea for field cases, for field studies and field testing, trying different approaches in different areas, even within a particular program. Making sure the system capacity exists. And this goes to everything from the policies are there, the government entities understand and support their own policies, they understand all of the program elements that are necessary, how to implement those, how to know if they're being implemented, dealing with operational capacity, financial capacity, and human resource capacity all at the same time. When you plan for scale up, you have to pay close attention to the cost effectiveness of that scale up. Is it possible to scale to a large level and still have that program be cost effective enough that that can lead to self-reliance in terms of program implementation? And how do you plan to use your resources in a way that are cost effective as well? And then, of course, the performance tracking. So can we build into our programs sufficient data collection, both quantitative and qualitative, not only around student performance results, but around change, those causal elements, what activity or what intervention causes what kind of change, to make sure we've built enough evidence to inform what a real scaled up program should look like that is realistic and then again stands the chance of moving toward independent sustainability. So when we look at some efforts to scale up EGR programs, you can see 10 countries are highlighted here, and it gives us some insight into how to scale up early grades reading programs. So on the left, you will see some things that contributed to successful scale up, and on the right, you will see some of the challenges that were barriers to successful scale up. Successful programs are specific to the context within which they are working. So the context is well known. It's taken into account early in the design portion of the program that these particular interventions have to be able to work in the realistic setting. Also, full-on collaboration between funders, implementers, and government. When the relationships are strong, when it's true partnerships and collaboration, those programs were more successfully scaled up. Linked to that, on the right-hand side, failing to build government capacity to carry out the implementation at scale is a real challenge and a real barrier. If the government doesn't have the skills that it needs and the structures that it needs to carry out implementation at a large scale, you will never move toward that area of self-reliant implementation. Also, enabling conditions, insufficient enabling conditions to institutionalize the program components. So are there things in place that act as enablers for particular program strategies to move forward, or are there things in place that are barriers to moving those program strategies forward? Anything else that you can think of that you see as successfully scaled up program elements or barriers you've seen that have kept programs from moving to scale up? We'd love to hear about them. So, improvement framework for scale up. We have a handout in your packet, and given our time constraints today, I'm not going to have you spend any time on that today, but I want to encourage you to take a look at it. The Early Grade Reading Program Scale Up Framework and Checklist. It includes all of the different relevant aspects of the existing approaches to scale up. It also takes into consideration the idea that early grades reading program improvement efforts are usually funded externally, but they do have the aim of being scaled up nationally and integrated into a country's system over time. So it's critical to take a look at this checklist as you think about your own programs, scale up capacity, to see where it is that you may have gaps or you have leverage points that you can use to move that idea of scale up forward. There are 3 key aspects of scale up that are included in the framework. You can see them in the blue box. The ingredients for success, what's needed for success, a roadmap, which is how do you get there, and the enabling environment. What are the conditions that have to be in place in order for scale up to be able to happen? So I encourage you after the webinar today to pull handout 2 and take a look at it relative to your own program work that you're engaged in currently. Okay, so here's where we want to take some time to have you take a look at handout 3. Okay, so you can see, I think on the screen, handout 3 is there. Conditions and considerations and conditions for scale up and sustainability. So I'm going to scroll down very slowly. So some of the conditions and considerations, demand for improvement is essential. There has to be an understanding at the national level, at every level actually, that improvement is needed, that things are not okay the way that they are. For stakeholders, as we've noted on here, both at the top and the bottom, this starts from families, this starts from classroom teachers and schools, and moves all the way up to the high level of government. And so you'll note there's some bullets here that you can actually use as kind of a self-assessment. I want to take a minute to let you kind of look at this demand for improvement and the 3 bullets there. Think about where you would rank your own program work at this point in time. The second consideration and condition is that a plan for scale up must be there, and you must be planning with scale up in mind. Scale up doesn't just happen. You have to have a plan in place from the beginning to make sure that you understand the scope of that scale up, you understand the pace at which it has to take place, and also about how your own design either in the end is scalable or is not scalable. This is about technical and human resources. It's about financial resources and being able to project forward to what will actually be necessary for scale to take place and how do you get there. Not necessarily is that possible, but what are the kinds of things that are enabling for that to happen? What are the kinds of things that are currently barriers? How do you use the period of your program work to make sure you take away the barriers, use the enabling factors, and move the program forward to make sure sustainability and scale up can happen? So take a look at the 3 bullets there, little minute to reflect and self-assess. The third one, cost and cost effectiveness. We've talked about this before. What are the costs of the components? Are they cost effective? Are they reasonable? Do they become more cost effective over time? Is there a continuing cost to the certain things that we're putting in place? Take a look at the self-assessment bullets, do a little reflection, resource allocation and distribution. Knowing what resources need to be available, what needs to be accounted for in budgets, how to get them distributed, where do you need critical external funding, and where does that funding need to cease to be made available, and can it cease to be made available during a period of scale up? Assess and strengthen the capacity of the system. We've talked about it a lot. I don't really need to repeat it, but is the system ready to take on a large scale program? Have you considered this in your program design, and to what extent? Address disruptions in the status quo. Now, what we've talked about, and mostly in the chat box today, is this issue of how do we take on the kinds of well-entrenched barriers that may just be present within a system because that's the way it's always functioned. It's this issue of business as usual. Do the factors of business as usual get in the way of a program coming to scale and then remaining sustainable? And how do we go after those business as usual barriers that can get in the way? Do you know, and have you addressed those disruptions in the status quo? Effective partnerships. Who do we work with? Who are the key players? Who can make the work happen? Who can bring it to a larger level? And that's at every single level. It's not just top end at the government level. Policies and regulations, protocols that are needed. Is there an enabling policy environment? Is there an enabling practical environment? How do we address those policies that are barriers? How do we address the practical aspects of the environment that can create barriers? And the last one, the incentives and the accountability measures. How do we create incentives for programs to move forward and grow? How do we continue to hold program implementation and program implementers accountable over time? These are all things that need to be considered. So, anything that you would like to add onto the discussion as we end the session today around these issues? So at this point, I'm actually going to have to hand it over to Allison. We will be taking a look at the chat as you move out, and we'll be trying to respond to anything key that comes there. Allison, I'm turning over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Mentioned several times, we love hearing from you, and this webinar and the subsequent ones are really built on what we've heard from the community of practice. And so if you have things that we can integrate, please get in touch with us. I'm going to bring up here just our contact information for myself and for Amy. There's also the General Global Reading Network email, which I assure you human beings do check on a daily basis, multiple ones, and we will get your email, and we're happy to respond if you're looking for resources or want to share something with us. We can also put it on our website or integrate it, as I said, into our different resources that we provide. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules and maybe late at night for some of you to attend today's session. All of the presentation materials and handouts are going to be posted to the website. Previous iterations are already there, but we'll get those up very shortly and send out a link to you where you can get this PowerPoint, and then we're also going to put all the handouts that we sent you just in the Google Drive. The list of upcoming webinars is here. I'm just going to highlight one of interest tomorrow. The USAID is presenting on adapting EGRA, the early grade reading assessment, to include sign language. So again, in the interest of making sure that our programs are reaching all learners, what can we do to understand the skills and needs of children with hearing impairments? So please register for that one and all of the upcoming ones. And if you aren't already connected with us, we are on various social media. We put out interesting information, links to other resources here as well. So we hope to find you there or at the next webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and have a good rest of your day or evening.
Thank you, everyone.